Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is an interesting one, as for as much as I think it does things like fleshing out the world of the series quite well, there's also arguably a stagnation that begins to set in with this very first sequel, as well as kind of losing sight on what made the first game so freaky. As you can see when being brought to the main menu, this screen kind of encapsulates one of my biggest issues when it comes to looking at the horror side of things this time round. Unlike before, where we had the single image of Freddy staring at us, now we've got what appear to be three brand new versions of Freddy, Bonnie and Chica looking at us. And that sets a principle almost straight away. What Cawthon's attempting to do with this sequel, much like most creators tend to do, is broaden his horizons and go for something even bigger than before. And as you could assume from how much I praised the first game for its relative simplicity, this seems to be going in essentially the opposite direction from the off. Starting a new game, we're once again given the setup in the form of a job listing in a newspaper. Fitting in with the idea of this being a sequel, we're told this will be a grand reopening for Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, whereas we can see in the picture which accompanies this, all the animatronics have had a substantial redesign, compared to before where their suits appeared to be made out of fabric. These guys seem to be made out of some glossy plastic. This however appears to be a purposeful misdirection in terms of when this game ultimately takes place in the series timeline, as although all indications push towards this being a brand new chapter for the pizzeria coming off the back of what we experienced in the first game, we'll eventually discover that Fnaf 2 actually works as a prequel. Putting that to one side for the moment however, with the tantalizing prospect of earning an even smaller figure of $100.50 a week, we enter the role of the genius who takes on the night shift. Taking one look at our brand new office, you can immediately see that quite a lot has changed compared to the first game, the most noticeable of which being the fact there now appears to be no doors to protect us, as well as featuring a huge opening directly in front of us, which makes us feel even more exposed. Before we get into that side of things though, let's start by looking at some of the more familiar elements that return, one of the most prominent being a certain someone who makes a return over the phone once again.
Hello and welcome to your new summer job at the new and improved Freddy Fazbear's Pizza.
That's right, the phone guy's made a comeback, and as you could already hear from his opening spiel, the level of misdirection is starting to become even more blatant. We're not only hearing the voice of a man who we essentially heard get killed in the first game, but once again, some of the very first bits of dialogue he comes out with has a strong emphasis on what he describes as the new and improved Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Claiming it's new is one thing, but improved quite literally means this place is building upon something that came before it. And as I've already alluded to, that improvement he's talking about is not in reference to the establishment we witnessed in the first game. Just like before, Phone Guy's message on this first night is the longest of them all by far, giving us a rundown of the several new mechanics that we can now utilize, as well as fleshing out the story even further. To begin with, after he's done introducing himself, in which he also describes our position as a new and exciting career path, he then immediately does almost a full 180 and starts addressing some of the rumors that have supposedly developed around the Freddy Fazbear establishment, predominantly the restaurant that came before this one.
Now, I want you to forget anything you may have heard about the old locations, you know. Some people still have a somewhat negative impression of the company. That old restaurant was kind of left to rot for quite a while, but I want to reassure you, Fazbear Entertainment is committed to family fun and above all, safety.
We're also told about some of the features the new animatronics now have. Things like facial recognition, advanced mobility.
They've spent a small fortune on these new animatronics. Facial recognition, advanced mobility. They even let them walk around during the day. Isn't that neat?
And although he may simply be trying to enthuse us once again by relaying any details that may seem even remotely interesting, the fact he mentions how they can wander about during the day is the first real time the curtain's peeled back to an extent. Because as we obviously heard when he brought this up during the first game, the animatronics were in fact not allowed to walk in the day due to the bite of 87.
They used to be allowed to walk around during the day too, but then there was the bite of 87. Yeah.
And let's not forget, having him refer to it in that way, and the way in which he delivers his lines, makes it seem like a well-known event that happened a fairly long time ago, meaning we've got our first indication that Fnaf 2 may be set several years in the past from the first game. Just like he did before, Phone Guy then proceeds to inform us of how the animatronics have been starting to behave strangely at night, with the previous guard deciding to move over to the day shift because of how they're attempting to get into the office.
You're only the second guard to work at that location. The first guy finished his week, but complained about conditions. We switched him over to the day shift. So, hey, lucky you, right? Mainly he expressed concern that certain characters seemed to move around at night and even attempted to get into his office. Now, from what we know, that should be impossible. That restaurant should be the safest place on Earth.
While in the first game, it wasn't really explained as to why this was happening, we were made to assume with all the details related to the children more than likely getting stuffed inside these suits, that the animatronics were essentially possessed. It wasn't merely a matter of them wandering into our office, like Phone Guy describes. They appeared to have malicious intent, constantly making our office their primary target each night. Here, there's an actual theory given as to why they're behaving in this way, with us being told that they might not have a proper night mode. So instead of shutting down when the pizzeria is closed for the night, they still wander around trying to find kids to interact with. And as we're the only humans in the building, they naturally start gravitating towards us. After this, we're told about 3 of the most vital new mechanics that have now been introduced. The music box, the Freddy head that we've been given, and our light that we can use in the hallway, in the 2 vents beside us, and also on all of the cameras.
There's a music box over by the prize counter, and it's rigged to be wound up remotely. So just every once in a while, switch over to the prize counter video feed and wind it up for a few seconds. It doesn't seem to affect all of the animatronics, but it does affect one of them.
Now we'll get into all those things in a second, but the final thing we should know is in relation to the actual threat this time round, and why it's even present. See, there's 2 things which Phone Guy mentions during this first night that will immediately send alarm bells ringing in your head when it comes to why these guys are coming after you. The more notable one comes towards the end of the phone call, where he says how there's apparently a minor glitch in the system, making it so they see us as an endoskeleton without our costume on.
You see, there may be a minor glitch in the system, something about the robot seeing you as an endoskeleton without his costume on and wanting to stuff you into the suit.
Exactly the same reasoning that was given during the first game, and although we saw in the game over screen we do very much appear to get stuffed inside a suit, it was obviously more about the actual intention that still left questions up in the air. Was it really about them seeing us as an endoskeleton, or was it something deeper? Well, in this case, we do at least have another potential reason as to why these guys are going to try and kill us, and that's how we're also told these brand new animatronics are apparently tied into a criminal database.
But most importantly, they're all tied into some kind of criminal database so they can detect a predator a mile away. Heck, we should be paying them to guard you.
Presumably by using this in conjunction with their facial recognition technology, they're able to identify any criminals they set their eyes on and act accordingly. If that means we're actually a criminal, or perhaps they're malfunctioning to a certain degree, is currently unknown. But it's not out the question, obviously, as using the Freddy head wouldn't just be a case of potentially fooling them into thinking we've got a suit on, but it also completely hides our face, so they can't use their facial recognition. Once we're done listening to Phone Guy, it's time to enter this nightmare for a second time. As you could assume, in this first night, not much really happens. It's another case where we're given the opportunity to inspect all the cameras, test out some of the new features, and generally just get to grips with the game as a whole. When it comes to the camera system in this game, it's basically laid out in the exact same way as before. The screen's brought up by hovering over the grey arrow at the bottom of the screen, and when it comes to all the individual cameras we can access, all we have to do is click on the several grey boxes to switch between them. The map in which these cameras are placed also appears visually identical, obviously having the layout differ to what we saw in the first game due to how we're in a different building this time, but still being mostly made up of simplistic boxes that vary in size and scale to reflect the size of each individual room. When it comes to all the environments we see when looking at each camera, there's some parts of this place that echo what we saw in the first game, and others that switch things up a bit. Take the show stage for example, that can be seen on camera 9. Just like before, there's almost nothing to actually observe when it comes to the background, with most of our attention being placed on the animatronics, all of which start their nights here every single time. Something you'll notice immediately, however, is that to even see the animatronics I've just mentioned, you're now having to utilize your brand new flashlight to illuminate the scene. This is the case for every single camera in the game. Despite there seeming to be no real issue when it comes to the power this time round, the whole facility is shrouded in absolute darkness. No matter what camera you're looking at, you're not going to be able to get a clear visual unless you turn on your flashlight. Now we'll obviously get more into the gameplay side of things in a second, but focusing on how this affects purely the camera system in the game, I have never been a fan of this choice. I like the flashlight idea when it comes to our office, but as you're seeing right now, applying it to the cameras feels like a waste in all aspects to me. Because there's now no power related repercussions when it comes to using our camera for example, we're made to rely on our flashlight most of the time to alert us of the threats that are coming our way. On the surface, it seems like an interesting concept. You're now having to use up some of your flashlight's battery to illuminate a scene and potentially spot one of these characters making their way towards you. But I'd say this ends up resulting in the exact same effect we experienced in the first game, and actually is probably even a bit worse. As we established, once you get a grip on the mechanics mechanics in Fnaf 1 and start reaching some of those harder nights, it's almost impossible to find yourself going around all the different cameras and tracking each animatronic. The power constraints and increasing threat from the animatronics themselves literally turn that into a non-option in the final few nights. And as I'd point out in any other game that does something like this, I believe that if these things have been implemented, they should actually be experienced to a substantial degree. It's a gameplay and visual problem for me in the first game. Once someone's figured out how the game works, there's no longer any reason for them to observe any other cameras outside a select few, which as a result ends up in the experience being simplified, and much of that atmosphere I talked about potentially going to waste on subsequent playthroughs. In my case, for example, I only got to experience that excellent atmosphere to its full potential because I was purposely playing in a way where I was trying to see everything and observe it closely. I know how the game ticks, and realistically could have been playing in a way that was more effective when it comes to conserving power, for example. And rightfully, that's what many players will find themselves doing when returning to these games, because ultimately, if you know how the game works, it's the most logical thing to do. Now when it comes to first time experiences, that's a whole different matter, as I think that just like most horror games, your first playthrough where you go in completely blind will almost always result in it being the most impactful and memorable one as well. But there's something about what the player may or may not get involved in as strongly on subsequent playthroughs that remains an issue for me, especially with the Fnaf games. Using another alternative example, in Resident Evil 7, there's a moment during the opening of the game where the main villain, Jack, walks across the screen. I can vividly remember the first time I saw this, as it freaked me out to an immense degree. Whenever I play the game nowadays, however, I essentially just run right past it without taking any real notice. And while it may sound like this presents an issue in terms of immersion, just like Fnaf, I once again pin it mainly down to the gameplay. The first time I saw this, I stopped dead in my tracks, fearful that I could potentially get discovered and killed. But after playing several times, I realised that even if I run full speed at him, he's never going to notice me and can't kill me. It hurts the immersion, of course, but it comes as a result of the gameplay. Tying this back into Fnaf 2's camera system, I feel the darkness of these images and usage of the flashlight to illuminate them ends up jeopardizing that immersion, possibly during a first playthrough even. All it really takes is for your flashlight to start running out and the general gameplay loop to be understood, and you'll soon realize that using your flashlight while on the cameras is ultimately only a detriment. When putting that to one side, however, and looking more at what's merely presented in these images, while I find things like the 3D modeling and unique style to still be impressive and distinct, I would still say the first game's layout is ultimately superior because of aspects like how I found it to be more tightly structured in a gameplay sense, and also how everything was on show at all times, compared to needing a flashlight to see the environments. I know I keep coming back to that flashlight, but it's a pretty big issue for me. While many of these rooms don't look bad whatsoever, the fact that both myself, and I have to imagine many other players, spend most of the time not using the flashlight in this way, and not actually witnessing the environments fully, it results in them standing out less because I'm not being exposed to them as much. Not to mention as well, but I feel there's a bit more padding when it comes to some of the rooms here, which can't even be excused with there being a greater amount of cameras, as there's only one more that's been added, albeit with all of these now actually working, compared to the kitchen camera that was busted in the first game. Take the two party rooms for example on cameras 2 and 3. Both of these look pretty good to me, and I particularly love the reinforcement of the same imagery we saw in Fnaf 1. The colourful hats and tables, the black and white checkerboard flooring, the grime that we can see covering the walls. That stuff is great, as although you could define it as retreading old ground somewhat, but I look at it more as exactly what I described, a positive reinforcement of an already unique style that we saw the first time. However, I'd say my main problem is the similarity between both images. They're reflecting the same environment in a near identical way, and if we look at camera 1, which shows a party room from a more similar angle to that of camera 2, my problem's highlighted even more clearly. One aspect I heavily praised in Fnaf 1's cameras is that I felt almost every single one had a purpose. There's no other camera that appears similar to the bathroom area, and there's no other one like the backstage. And even when it came to the two hallways, elements like the positioning of the animatronics within those hallways, as well as the additional lighting details and different objects found in the two scenes, make them quite a bit different to each other. Even the angle of the camera ends up resulting in a substantially different image. That's nowhere to be seen really when it comes to these three cameras in Fnaf 2. They're all showing essentially the exact same thing. The only real variation comes from details I consider to be fairly minor, like having one of these rooms have balloons, or a wet floor sign with a puddle of water on the floor. I'm not saying there's no variation whatsoever, it's just that I don't find it substantial enough to be praised really. Camera 4's basically the only one of these party rooms that presents something different, taking much of the focus away from the party tables and balloons, and instead having these 3 figures on the wall serve as the highlight. So you get my point, even small additions and rearrangements can create a significant impact when it comes to the individual traits and personality of each scene. And although I've ragged on the party rooms for faltering in that regard, something which I'd also say applies to the vent cameras as well, many other cameras here present us with some great images, which much like all of the cameras are oftentimes enhanced greatly when the animatronics also show up in them. Camera 7 for example, which gives us a visual of the bathrooms, doesn't appear all that different to the camera 7 in the first game that also overlooked the bathrooms. Add Toy Chica or Withered Bonnie to the scene however, and you've got an image that's a bit more lively. And while you could ultimately say that was also the case for the first game, there's other factors that play into the atmosphere this time round, which made me feel quite a few of these almost required the animatronics to be in them to unsettle me, whereas before I found the overall environment quite unsettling on its own. Camera 11 shows us the prize corner, being found in the same room as the show stage and game area. This is the camera you'll find yourself coming back to more than any other, as it's here where that music box is located. And something that's highlighted prominently in this scene, which I feel was already pulled off well in the first game, is the merchandising side of things we see. Again, Cawthon always seems to find a way to introduce a nice amount of charm to his games, and I feel that strongly when it comes to these kinds of elements. I'd argue that it mainly stems from the undeniable irony of the situation we find ourselves in. While spending our night fending off against these animatronic killers, we get to see them painted out in a completely different light when it comes to these cutesy posters and toys. There's a contrast that's created between what these guys were created for and what we're actually dealing with, which not only do I find pretty hilarious, but also somewhat insightful when thinking about what it must actually be like during the daytime and how different the animatronics must act. The game area itself doesn't have that much to show surprisingly, with the highlights being the small carousel we see on the right, showing Freddy, Chica, Bonnie and Foxy in their animal forms, compared to their animatronics which always stand upright, as well as also showing Balloon Boy on the left hand side, another new animatronic with one of the more unique functions in the game. Looking at cameras 8 and 12 however, we're presented with 2 scenes that start showing some of the more broken down and rotten elements that noticeably stand out from the otherwise pristine surroundings we've been seeing. There is still some dirt and grime that can be found in this place, and our office still appears to be filled with the same exposed metal wires that we saw before, but it's nowhere near the level of Fnaf 1's pizzeria. This place at least looks like it's been actively maintained. Camera 12 however, which shows us an area referred to as Kids Cove, mainly stands out because of the animatronic that starts there every night. Without it, the camera's basically observing nothing at all. But although we'll talk more about it when going over each animatronic, this absolute wreck is our first glimpse of how not everything here is as new and fresh as we've been made to think. And this especially goes for camera 8, another camera that's defined by the animatronics contained within it. These guys appearing far more similar to the ones we saw in the first game, but having that same level of disrepair now highlighted in their designs. While I like these cameras in terms of what they present in an animatronic sense, you must see where my problems arise once again. Just like I talked about with the fairly similar party rooms, I can't say there's anything of any real note once the animatronics leave these areas. It's not like the backstage in the first game, where you've got that great visual of the endoskeleton and multiple heads behind it. Once these guys leave, these rooms have nothing to really offer in a visual or gameplay sense. And while you could try throw that criticism at some of the other rooms in this game and the first one, I don't think it really applies to the same extent. Take the dining area in the first game for example. Without the animatronics, you still obviously had multiple elements in the scene that fleshed out the overall style of the game. But when it comes to the gameplay side of things, this was the area that Bonnie and Chica, the 2 most prevalent animatronics, would oftentimes revert to as a meeting point of sorts. Whether you were utilizing it or not, it had the function of identifying certain animatronics' whereabouts, because it wasn't uncommon for them to leave and return. In Fnaf 2, once these guys are out, they're out. They don't ever return to their starting points, and they ultimately remain pointless for the rest of the night. In Fnaf 1, even if there was no one currently in the dining area for example, you know it can still be looked at throughout the whole night as a way of locating animatronics. Overall, while I'm not particularly disappointed by the camera system in this game, I'm also not thrilled about it either. I feel like it does have a few more shortcomings compared to what we saw in the first game that can sometimes cancel out some of the good stuff. Some great visual design can be hampered to a degree when I see it repeated in several other cameras, and especially when it comes to the gameplay side of things, we once again find ourselves in a position where despite having numerous cameras that in my opinion should all be utilized to an equally important effect, there's only 1 or 2 here that you'll find yourself fixated on as the game goes on because of the substantial role they play when it comes to surviving. At the start of night 2, Phone Guy starts talking about the broken down animatronics in the parts and service room, once again painting the game out as an outright sequel, with how he says they were from the previous location.
By now I'm sure you've noticed the older models sitting in the back room. Those are from the previous location, and we just use them for parts now. The idea at first was to repair them. They even started retrofitting them with some of the newer technology, but they were just so ugly, you know?
However, with the small detail he gives about how at one point they were planned to be updated with new parts and brought back to life, it leaves a door open for the possibility that they eventually went on to actually get this restoration in the future, which is why we see them in Fnaf 1. As I've stated a few times now, this game is definitely made to be a prequel, as is shown by some of the story details that are revealed towards the end. While he says these old models shouldn't have the ability to wander around, he for some reason says this with the caveat that our Freddy head trick should work on them if they were somehow to become active. The disingenuousness from the Phone Guy shining through once again, which is highlighted even more when discussing Foxy the pirate.
Oh yeah, Foxy. Hey listen, that one was always a bit twitchy. I'm not sure if the Freddy head trick will work on Foxy.
He's literally just told us that these older models shouldn't be walking around. Yet a second later, he's describing Foxy as always being a bit twitchy, and that if he ends up in our hallway, we'll need to flash our light to keep him out our office. Our Freddy head trick apparently not working on him. He's contradicted himself in a matter of seconds, and exactly like the first game, it immediately makes us doubt the information he's actually telling us. Talking of Foxy though, he's now one of 11 brand new animatronics, and that includes the withered characters, as when looking at their designs as well as how they individually function, they appear and act quite a bit different to the ones in the first game. Looking at the two Freddy models side by side shows what I mean. Despite obviously being based off the same style of character, there's key differences in this new withered version, like their extra buttons on his chest, the lack of freckles on his face, and also the fact that he's a whole lot more beaten up here. But I have no real issue with that, and that applies to pretty much all of the withered animatronics, as although the first design of Freddy goes down as the original and arguably most iconic version of Freddy Fazbear in the series, there's a lot more detail to be found in this updated version. Not just when it comes to the visual switch-ups, despite them all being carried out well, but even when you look between the fabric on both models, their eyes and teeth, the microphones they're both holding. You can see these all appear in a much higher quality. You can actually see the texturing of the mesh on the microphone head, for example, whereas in the first game it appeared more like a steel ball. And even when you look at their torsos, despite the dirtier appearance the withered version naturally has, there's a greater sense of texture in terms of how the models have been sculpted. And as I said, I think this applies to all the withered variants of these animatronics. I think all their designs are great. Withered Chica is damn terrifying. Her eyes and mouth sit wide open, there's exposed wiring shooting out of her hands, and the strange position she assumes, which shows her posturing in this T-pose stance, is bizarre. Withered Foxy is arguably the most similar to his Fnaf 1 counterpart, which makes sense considering he was the only animatronic in that game who was already busted up. But much like Freddy, along with some new features like how his left ear is now ripped off, exposing the endoskeleton beneath, there appears to be a noticeable improvement when it comes to the model's material, and an overall great attention to detail. Withered Bonnie arguably has the biggest switch up of all though. While the elements of the model which are retained seem near identical to how they appeared before, it's more the elements that aren't that define his character in this game. And that's most noticeable of course when it comes to his face, having essentially his entire face ripped off, with the only thing that remains being his jaw on the bottom. I think Bonnie's design here is fantastic, with the key feature of his glowing red eyes giving him a degree of menace that I don't feel as strongly in any of the other animatronics. Despite being torn to shreds and even having one of his arms missing, he carries a presence that's as scary as it is intimidating. With all that being said, no matter if you're seeing these guys in your hallways, on the cameras, or even in your office, while they feed more into the kind of design you'd expect from a horror game, compared to before where they appeared very similar to real-world animatronics, they're all still great threats that keep things fresh with their new designs, retaining what was great about the first ones and keeping their identity, while heading in a slightly different direction, so you're not just repeating what we saw previously. I want to say as well, especially when they come into your office, the scale of these are one of the key elements that you can feel a lot more strongly compared to Fnaf 1. These guys tower over you when standing in your office, which once again does a great job at keeping these guys a sizable threat. The unfortunate thing is, while I'd say this applies to some of the other animatronics in the game, I've got to be honest and say that I've never been impressed with the vast majority of these when looking at them from a horror point of view. Starting with the toy animatronics, I think they fell terribly on the horror front. front, with the only real exception being Mangle, which kind of fits in its own separate category anyway. Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, and Toy Chica stepped too far in the direction that Cawthon was pursuing with the original animatronics, and as a result, I rarely found them scary at any point. There's no uncanny valley, there's nothing ominous about these guys. I suppose I don't have any real problem when it comes to how they've been designed, but with their bright colours and glossy plastic material, they've literally never made me feel unsettled. While I thought the withered animatronics were taking a step in the direction of appearing horrific in a more conventional sense, they still achieve that goal effectively. The toys, for the most part, simply appear friendly, even when they are being put in positions where they're supposed to be sinister. Two images that spring to mind are when Toy Bonnie's looking into the camera, and when Chica looks into the bathroom cam in the previous game. Just look at how much more sinister Chica looks in comparison. And even if we want to use the example where Bonnie's right in front of the camera, this is more ridiculous to me compared to anything else. So yeah, I'm somewhat conflicted on the toys. I've always enjoyed their slick new designs, but that's merely appreciating them from a stylistic point of view. When put in practice, I just don't think they gel very well with the overall experience. As I say, the original animatronics resonated because of that uncanny valley factor. These new versions not only appear too friendly to me, even when they're staring into cameras, appearing in our vents, and having their eyes turn black, but there's something about them that's too robotic and unrealistic, which also takes away from the scare factor. As I say though, the only exception to that would be Mangle, but that's more because this thing actually has a closer resemblance to the withered animatronics. To put it simply, Mangle was a massive pile of junk with a white and pink foxy head slapped onto it. Its body parts were all jumbled up, with a hand appearing where the head should realistically be. And overall, it's just an absolute mess. You've got missing eyes, exposed wires, and most of what we can see is the metal endoskeleton, that assumedly at one point was covered up by the same kind of plastic exterior we see on the other toys. Mangle feeds perfectly into that fear of the unknown I've previously referred to, and I mean that in the sense where despite being able to see all parts of Mangle clear as day, it's still hard to identify what we're actually looking at. Not to mention as well, but I find the way in which Mangle appears when it comes to some of the cameras it shows up in, as well as when it makes its way into our office, is equally freaky. But we'll get more into that when talking about how all these animatronics behave, because especially when it comes to Mangle, audio plays a huge factor when it comes to locating it, and how that equally unsettles the player from how visceral the audio is. Finally, you've got what I perceive as the most unique figures in the game, those being Balloon Boy, the Marionette, and the reappearance of Golden Freddy. Golden Freddy's just about what you'd expect realistically. He's essentially the exact same slumped over model that we see in the first game, with him now being redesigned to fit more in line with the style of the withered Freddy that we see in this game. Balloon Boy might be interesting functionally, but is one of the weirdest inclusions of all, considering how unthreatening he both appears and acts in relation to you. And then you've got the Marionette, the figure that we can see gradually rise out in the music box if we fail to wind it up in time. As we'll eventually go on to see, the Marionette, or the puppet as it's commonly referred to, ends up becoming one of the most pivotal figures in the entire franchise. And from a design point of view, despite still sharing certain characteristics from the toys, like the rosy red cheeks and plastic face, this is exactly the direction I would have hoped the others followed. Because although we're still stepping in the direction of complete unreality, the puppet's tall, slender figure, the white and black stripes that heavily resemble the flooring of the pizzeria, and the tears that appear to be streaming from its eyes, all this stuff makes the puppet look and feel both extremely unnerving, but also important when merely observing it, because as you would have heard from those last two features I listed, there's not only a connection that's drawn to particular characteristics of the pizzeria itself, something that's not shared in any of the other animatronics, but you've also got a direct callback to the crying images we could occasionally see on the right hallway in Fnaf 1. On the whole, when it comes to the overall look of these guys, hit and miss is the best I can describe them as. While I find the withered animatronics both look great and retain a level of scariness, the fresher designs of the toy animatronics substitute style for that scariness. But naturally, that's not the only thing they've got to offer, and as we'll find when diving into their individual behaviours and how they all flow together, I find the dynamic they all end up creating, while sacrificing the excellent ambience from the first game to an extent, actually ends up in a gameplay experience I found to be even more engaging than previously. At the start of this night, Phone Guy once again congratulates us on our survival. Our survival in a place where time and time again, we're being told there shouldn't be anything to worry about. He then talks about Mangle, explaining the reason he appears like a pile of junk is due to the kids that are allowed to play with him.
They tried to remake Foxy, you know? They thought the first one was too scary, so they redesigned it to be more kid-friendly instead of in Kids Cove, to keep the toddlers entertained, you know? But kids these days just can't keep their hands to themselves. The staff literally had to put Foxy back together at the end of every shift. Eventually they just stopped trying and left them as some kind of take apart, put back together attraction. Now he's just a mess of parts. I think the employees refer to him as just the mangle.
Before signing off, Phone Guy also warns us not to trust any potential rumours and stories that we may hear getting spread about the pizzeria. A hilarious thing to say, considering much of what we've been told by this guy in both this game and the previous one has almost always been contradicted by what we experience for ourselves.
I can personally assure you that whatever is going on out there, however tragic it may be, has nothing to do with our establishment. It's just all rumor and speculation, people trying to make a buck, you know.
What he's referring to here seems to be more in the vein of the Bite of 87 we were told about before. We have to remember, although we're constantly experiencing a full-on nightmare during the night shift, these animatronics are assumedly not behaving in the same way during the daytime. And with that knowledge, and Phone Guy's status of being a fairly untrustworthy figure, it seems that these rumours could potentially be linked to another incident occurring with one of the visitors. Diving into the gameplay, let's start off with the most notable feature that's been changed from the last game, and that's the lack of any doors. Our office in Fnaf 2 makes us feel just about as exposed as humanly possible. We're coming into this game with the knowledge these animatronics are eventually going to start making their way towards our position to try and kill us. So ingeniously, Cawthon decides this time to remove the only real feeling of safety we had in the first game, and replace them with two new features that are now our main way of staying alive. And those of course are the flashlight which we can use down our main hallway, and also the Freddy mask that we're able to put on. These replacements are the sole reason why stripping out the doors ends up being a fantastic idea, as despite their ultimate effectiveness, they just seem so inferior in comparison. A solid metal door that slams down compared to a flimsy mask that we stick on our head while praying the animatronics don't kill us. So already from ramping up the tension of this scenario, it gets off to a great start. The flashlight, despite technically being a new feature, obviously serves the exact same function as the door lights in the first game, that being to illuminate threats and even deal with some of them as well. The only real difference is that alongside the light switch are activated by buttons on our right and left, with these buttons now illuminating the vents this time round. We can also use lights on all the cameras and down the hallway in front, this being the first instance where our keyboard's now getting utilised, as whenever we want to activate the flashlight, we actually have to press the control key to switch it on. That's where the animatronics' individual functions start coming more into play, and when it comes to the flashlight, there's two here that entirely revolve around essentially removing it from your toolkit, and those are Foxy and Balloon Boy. Foxy has a fairly similar function to what we saw before, however, compared to checking up on him with the cameras every few seconds, it's now a case of flashing your light at him in the hallway. And from there, it's the same routine of checking up on him frequently to stop him diving into your room and murdering you. Balloon Boy plays directly into this, and you'd have to describe him as the first real support animatronic, because unlike every other one we've gone up against so far, Balloon Boy never actually jump scares you. From that perspective alone, he's already one of the most unique animatronics in the game. But then you've also got the fact that with every movement, we hear him either laugh or say hello. This not only giving him a greater deal of personality, but also being quite a nice leveler when it comes to some of the later nights where our attention's being drawn all over the place. We'll see Cawthon employ this same audio-based notification to some other animatronics in the future, but that's what I mainly see it as, a more blatant indication that allows some of those later nights to feel a bit more fair to a certain degree. Now, if you fail to identify where he is and allow him into your office, he'll stand right in front of you, laugh, and simultaneously shut off your flashlight. So although Balloon Boy doesn't have a jump scare of his own, he's directly responsible for the Foxy jump scare that occurs after. So when thinking about it, he's only really unique when looking from the point of view that he doesn't instantly kill you, and it's not him that does the killing. But I guess you can still ultimately boil his function down to keep him out your office, otherwise you're dead. One thing I haven't mentioned about the flashlight, however, is that when it comes to using it on our cameras, there is an actual function that ties into slowing the progress of certain animatronics, because as we're told by Phone Guy during the second night, flashing our light at them seems to cause them to temporarily freeze, and this is genuinely reflected in-game as well. There are certain exceptions, like how none of the animatronics can be stunned while on the show stage, parts and service room, or Kids Cove, but as you could assume, that's because it would literally prevent any of these guys leaving their initial positions. While it still becomes far less practical in some of the later nights, the stun effect is made to last 400 frames, translating to around 6.5 seconds. That's quite a bit of time in the grand scheme of things, and using this method, I've managed to keep many animatronics on one set camera for a substantial amount of time. This same effect doesn't apply to the animatronics we find in our hallway though, with the stun time in this case lasting under a second. However, you've also got the battery issue to consider as well. So while this fairly obscure feature can very much be useful, it should also be utilized wisely, as when it comes down to it, you can at least rely on the Freddy mask if they make their way into your office, whereas Foxy will end up killing you if you run out of battery. When it comes to the Withereds and toys, they aren't really all that different from what we saw in the first game either. Despite there being more of them, this purely results in us getting attacked more frequently, compared to any of them having particularly unique functions on their own, which I find a bit of a shame really, as it does start giving off that feeling of quantity over quality once again. It's similar to how I feel about those several party rooms that don't distinguish themselves very well. The main way someone like Toy Freddy attacks us, for example, is by walking straight up to your office down the front hallway, and then when you look to how the withered version of Freddy attacks us, he once again walks straight up to our office down the main hallway. And that's the case for most of these guys essentially. They all behave and attack in almost the exact same ways. The most amount of praise I can identify when it comes to their movements is the wider level of variety in terms of the individual scenes we now bear witness to. We haven't quite reached perfection yet, but in many instances, that issue we saw in the previous game where only one animatronic will be shown on a camera despite there being two in the same room is solved to an extent. I'd say the main hallway is likely the best example of this, to be honest. If Foxy and Bonnie both find themselves in it together, we actually see a unique image of them both standing in the hallway. Same goes for things like if Foxy and Mangle are in the main hallway, if Freddy and Balloon Boy are in the game area, and if Mangle and Chica are both on the bathroom cam. All good stuff, but as I say, this doesn't apply to everything. When Toy Freddy and Chica occupy the main hallway, for example, there's no scenario where any other animatronics are shown alongside them. But I'll give it a pass, as it's definitely a step in the right direction. This doesn't remove the point that I initially started with, however. While the visuals may be slightly more varied, their behaviours most definitely aren't. When it comes to the toys, you've got Chica who comes in from the left vent, Bonnie who comes in from the right, and Freddy who comes down the middle. The withered animatronics do the exact same thing, with the only difference being that Bonnie and Chica's positions are swapped. And guess what? That literally doesn't matter whatsoever because of the manner in which they enter your office. That's where the Freddy head comes into play, which as you've heard, is now our only way of surviving upon having one of these guys enter the room. I'm somewhat conflicted on how much I actually enjoy the Freddy head mechanic, as although I like the idea of it and think the manner in which it's carried out is great when it comes to that actual visual we see when putting it on and the panicked breathing sounds we hear. On the functionality side of things once again, I can't help but feel there was quite a bit more depth when it came to the doors in the first game. When you shut one or two of the doors in that case, power was obviously the main thing that you'd ultimately be concerned over. But those power issues weren't tied directly to the doors. There were numerous things and many mistakes you could be making that surmount, turning that power issue into one that's multifaceted. The way the mask works is more akin to a QuickTime event, with that especially applying to the withered animatronics. The vent shafts work almost the exact same way as our doorways from before. Once one of the animatronics enters one of them, we hear the distinct sound of them banging around, essentially a warning that you'll have to deal with them soon. The toy versions actually appear in our vents when turning on our lights, with this also applying to Mangle and Balloon Boy, who also make their way into the office from the vents. However, the withered versions appear directly in our office when pulling down our camera screen, with Toy Freddy being the only toy animatronic who also enters in this same manner. That's predominantly why I think of them as a QuickTime event, as especially in the case of these ones, the only thing you're being told by the game is get that mask on or you're dead. The effect is less extreme with the ones who appear in the vents. You don't get that immediate shock of having the animatronic towering over you, or the flashing lights and distorted audio that accompanies them. It's actually quite bizarre how tame it is, because if you remember in the first game, whenever you flash your lights on the animatronics, you'd get that fairly loud warning sound, giving us a small fright, but also giving that immediate feedback yet again, where over time, the player will instinctually close the door as soon as possible. Turning on the lights while they're peeking out the vents, that audio cue's not only gone, but there's no cue whatsoever, hampering the impact they're creating and relaying less information to the player. But one of the most bizarre things for me comes from what we actually see when putting on the mask. For all the animatronics who appear fully in our office, nothing really changes. The audio and visual effects continue on until the animatronic leaves, in which you can then take off the Freddy mask safely. The ones in the vents, however, are weirdly inconsistent. Toy Bonnie, for example, isn't far off the instances I already mentioned, having those same effects we saw previously, but sliding in front of our mask from a far closer position. It's unique, I'll give it that, but there's always something that's felt lazy when it comes to this animation, as it really does look purely like a PNG sliding across the screen, whereas in the past, Cawthon's always done a relatively good job at disguising those things and making them blend together. But then we look to the other ones, and there's no animation whatsoever. I'm not sure if this was because of time constraints, or perhaps a resource issue, but outside of Toy Bonnie, none of these other ones give any indication they've gone except the exact same sound they generate when entering the vents. I've always found that in particular quite strange. If you're going to throw up an animation when Toy Bonnie's in the vent, why not do the same for Chica, Balloon Boy, or Mangle? The only argument I could conjure up is that it's intentionally done to add an element of confusion to the mix, mainly because of that vent sound. As there's no visual indication these guys have actually gone, you can oftentimes get tricked into thinking they've already left by the sound of another animatronic entering the vents, with the only exception being Mangle, as you're able to actively hear when he's gone because of the noise he generates. But even then, I just find it all a bit cheap. I wouldn't go as far to say it's outright unfair, but that kind of trickery doesn't sit right with me. Because if we look back to the first game, everything was laid out clear as day realistically. If the animatronics come to your door, you close them and use your lights to check when they've left. In Fnaf 2, you either get an animation that's straight to the point, or are made to wait for a while and sometimes make a guess as to if the vent sound which is generated correlates to the one you spotted. You make the mistake of taking off your mask too early, and you might ultimately get bitten due to other aspects like the music box and Foxy we're also dealing with. So yeah, mixed feelings in regards to all that stuff. Despite being a bit more frantic, I'd arguably say we've taken a step back from how we survived during the first game. I appreciated the strategy a whole lot more, and the telegraphing that came from the animatronics felt more consistent, fair, and satisfying to deal with. Talking of the music box, however, this arguably works as a second Foxy when you boil it down. It's just that whereas checking on Foxy has always been immediate, the music box will take more or less time to deal with depending on how far you let it run down. This mechanic's directly tied to the marionette. If you fail to keep it wound up, the marionette will swiftly rise out the box found in the prize corner and come to kill you. There's no way of preventing death once he's out, so it's absolutely essential you keep this thing wound up. The further you get into the game, the quicker this thing runs down. And overall, the only real problem I have with this thing comes down to all the other cameras in the game. With Foxy now having to be tackled down a hallway, there was a brilliant opportunity here for our camera system to be purely used as a tool for locating animatronics and halting their progress with our flashlight. With the introduction of the music box though, we're right back in the same position as we were last time, where once you figure out that all you need to really focus on is camera 11, the idea of looking at any other cameras here starts looking rather pointless. And that's affected even more significantly due to factors of the music box I actually enjoy. We've now got a dynamic where we need to be actively monitoring two time-based threats in both our office and on the cameras. Spend too long winding up that music box and you leave yourself open to an attack from Foxy. But equally, if you aren't staying on top of the music box, you could find yourself running out of time because of aspects like checking on Foxy or dealing with the animatronics that enter your room. Frantic is the key word that comes to mind once again. Things can start getting really tense when your attention's being diverted all over the place. And adding even further to that, you've also got to understand that on top of your flashlight occasionally bugging out, which means you're unable to check on Foxy for a short while, the animatronics that enter our room actually force us out of the camera screen occasionally. So even if you reach the music box just as it's about to run out, your progress could still be halted by one of the animatronics. All these dynamics are fantastic and create an experience that can oftentimes be really engaging. Once you start reaching nights 3, 4, and 5, there's hardly any points where I find myself merely sitting in my office not doing anything, something that did occur more often during the first game because of the generally slower pace, less threats, and power meter. And with all that being said, while you can clearly see that the overall gameplay experience that we get this time round is one that could be described as a whole lot more engrossing, it also opens the gateway for the game to feel nowhere near as scary. Although I bring up sitting around not doing much in the first game, that's actually something that ends up resulting in a greater amount of appreciation being given to other elements of the game. Because there's not as many threats to constantly be dealing with, I spent more time really taking in the ambience, the atmosphere, and observing more of the cameras, all because I wasn't being bombarded with so many different things at all times. When your mind's constantly focused on winding up a music box, flashing your light down the corridor, checking your vents, putting on the Freddy mask, you could argue the gameplay has a bigger risk of becoming formulaic, as I alluded to with some of the particularly difficult difficult nights in the first game. But whereas I felt I was given a substantial amount of time to bathe in the atmosphere of the first game, Fnaf 2 starts becoming relatively intense fairly early on. That's not to say there's no scares to be found here, but just judging that side of things from a gameplay point of view, I find the way in which the new editions broadens everything can very much take away from aspects that I really appreciated about the first game. And that's not me saying the atmosphere should have been identical to the first, but I was hoping for one that was equally unsettling, and the gameplay is a large part of why I don't think that's ultimately achieved. The balance feels like it's gone too far in the direction of having the experience feel constantly engaging, which is only really an issue when it comes to a game like Fnaf in particular. For those of you who've watched any of my previous videos, I'm a strong believer in having games be as interactive as possible, even when it comes to some of my personal favourites like Metal Gear Solid 2. I have no issue with people criticising the sheer amount and length of cutscenes in that game, as although I personally enjoy them, I don't think they're actually appropriate for the video game format considering how long they are. The unique thing about games is that we get to play them, and spending loads of time watching takes away from that quality. So, why am I asking for essentially the exact opposite in this scenario? Well, it's mainly because of how this game's structured. Whereas in many other games, you're given the freedom to progress at your own leisure, and are often given patches of quiet time that allows a greater opportunity to experience things outside of the core gameplay loop. There's nothing like that in Fnaf. This is why the balance of each night is so important in this instance, as if the game becomes too intense early on, you're never being given the chance to really take in that atmosphere. And as I say, I feel this is something the first game pulls off quite a bit more effectively. But even when saying that, there's also an overtness and explicitness when it comes to the general ambience of Fnaf 2 that makes it feel like it's trying too hard to purposely unsettle the player at points. And that's not just something we can observe when it comes to the visuals, but perhaps more importantly, the audio. From Night 4 onwards, there's no more real advice that's conveyed to the player, with us purely getting further elaborations on those rumours that we heard about during Night 3. It turns out that these rumours and speculation we were told about actually had some weight, with Phone Guy now informing us that an investigation's been launched, which will result in the restaurant being closed for a few days.
There's been somewhat of an investigation going on. We may end up having to close for a few days, I don't know. I want to emphasize, though, that it's really just a precaution. Fazbear Entertainment denies any wrongdoing. These things happen sometimes.
As per usual, he does a terrible job at painting this out in any kind of good light, immediately going for legal related talk and claiming that Fazbear Entertainment denies any wrongdoing. What's even worse is that directly after trying to convince us that everything's fine, he starts going into how we should ideally be avoiding eye contact with the animatronics now because of how someone's been tampering with their facial recognition systems. As a result of this, their behaviour during the day has apparently started fitting more in line with what we've been experiencing, unusual and aggressive. The only thing is, this apparently only applies to adults. When it comes to the kids that are visiting, they act completely normal.
But the characters have been acting very unusual, almost aggressive towards the staff. They interact with the kids just fine, but when they encounter an adult, they just stare.
Although this is brought up in the same breath as the tampering of the facial recognition systems, it's unclear if this behaviour may relate to something more supernatural once again. We already garnered from the first game that spirits, possession, and sentient animatronics are all on the table here, so there's a chance these guys are now independently showing an active aversion to adults, outside of merely their facial recognition abilities. And to be honest, if this is something that's only being picked up on now, it pushes us back more into the realm of them being possessed once again, as it wouldn't particularly make sense for them to be actively tracking us down and attempting to kill us during the night if their facial recognition has only just been tampered with. When it comes to the audio in this game, this is another component which once again I'm somewhat mixed on. The first thing we have to establish is that much like we saw when it came to how the gameplay flowed in this game, there appears to be a deliberate decision to go in a different direction, at least to me. As you would have heard during my discussion of the first game, one of my favourite parts of the experience, which I found to be absolutely essential and exceptional when it came to setting up a really creepy atmosphere, was the ambience. It was stark, unsettling, and had a huge emphasis on drones for the vast majority of it, whether it be in the main menu or in the game itself. We're not hearing any real semblance of rhythm or recognisable chord progressions. It's the pinnacle of what ambience should be, but simultaneously, it's ambience that accompanied the visuals perfectly. It's an aspect that, while being ever present, didn't feel distracting either, and when paired up with some of the more tangible sounds in the game, like Foxy's shanty, Freddy's Toreador march, or the footsteps of the animatronics, the game's never really silent. silent, but it's never overwhelming either. This is a very important factor to recognise when taking a look at how Fnaf 2 deals with its ambience, as on the surface, in-game, it seems like we're almost going in the same direction. The main menu does show a contrast to what we saw in the first one, now having a theme that's a bit more musical, with noticeable rhythms being introduced, and standout instrumentation like the percussion and string bass sounds we can hear. But when jumping into the actual game, while there is a degree of ambience, I rarely felt like I was given the opportunity to truly bathe in it, which was a large part of why I appreciated FNAF 1's audio design so much. It's not just a matter of what's been created and inserted into these scenarios. If the player isn't able to properly distinguish and experience these elements, they're essentially going to waste. And to a degree, that is how I feel somewhat with this game. For starters, it's important to realise that there's now two distinct ambient tracks that are now played, one of which is even more subtle compared to the first game, and the other of which is significantly less subtle when plays for almost the entirety of the night. Now the first of these I have no real issue with. It stays in the same vein of the drones we heard in the first game, being able to hear this hollow, almost wind-like sound on the upper end of the track, while also getting these incredibly bassy sounds on the lower end. It's good, but just not that impactful for me personally. I feel that hollowness was amped up to a more substantial degree the first time round, and while I do find the ambience more subtle here, I also find it ends up lacking the same degree of variety as well. Despite both being drones, there's multiple parts in the first game's ambience that remain distinct, whereas FNAF 2's remains more consistent and flows more seamlessly. This is where we start getting into the aspects which I feel actually take away from the general ambience and creepiness, however, and it primarily stems from the bombardment of the other sounds we're hearing, and the second ambient track I mentioned a second ago. The first thing I want to point out is that even while this first drone track's playing, there's now oftentimes so many other sounds you're also hearing that I describe as almost getting in the way. While in your office, it might not seem like too big of an issue, because the sounds we hear in this area are even less substantial than what we heard in the first game. It's more what we hear when drawing up our camera that can lead to some bigger issues for me. As I just said with the office, the camera ambience is equally tame, compared to those more overt sounds we heard in the first game of the cameras moving around and crashing. You've got a more consistent and admittedly appropriate track that fits in better while looking at our camera system. There's two things which can immediately raise those audio levels, however, turning what was already a fairly withdrawn ambient track into one that's almost unrecognisable. And that's camera 11, which features the music box, as well as Mangle when wherever he shows up. It's a to and fro realistically, and I could understand many people seeing this as a non-issue, but it's undeniable when looking purely at the ambience of the game that these two elements draw back from it quite substantially. On the positive side of things, the sounds we hear in these two instances bolster the personality of both the marionette and Mangle. When you hear the sound of the music box and the distorted garble from Mangle, you'll directly associate that audio with these two animatronics. The only issue is that especially when it comes to the music box, we're just hearing it all the time. So you've got a fairly quiet ambience that features less distinguishable parts than the first game, the sound of the camera system, the sound of the music box, and even potentially Mangle as well, who can also find himself in the prize corner. I wouldn't call it a cacophony, as that would be a bit too extreme, but for me, I feel like it does start reaching a point where the audio's distracting enough to where I'm not being pulled into the experience, at least not to the same degree I was before. What I would start describing as a bit of a cacophony is when that second ambient track gets introduced. As compared to the initial one, this is a lot more overt in what it's trying to achieve. This is a track that, while definitely being distinct, debatably even more distinct than the first game, comes at the cost of throwing that subtlety I've been talking about completely out the window. As a result of that, I'd also have to say that when it comes to unsettling me and creeping me out, I think I only really achieved that on my very first playthrough when I'm hearing it for the first time. Outside of that, I find the track itself conveys the feeling of intensity and stress a whole lot more, which I actually feel is entirely appropriate, even despite the more explicit intention we can distinguish from the track. Because as we established when discussing the gameplay, intensity and stress are two things that I feel define a large part of the experience already. I'm not saying you can't have one with the other. I'm not saying something can't be intense and creepy at the same time. It's just in this case, I find that's not what's achieved. Once audio tracks like this kick in, I find myself in a position where I'm purely attempting to stay focused and in control. This is why I was identifying the difference between a first playthrough and subsequent playthroughs a second ago. As well, I can identify how this could lead players to feeling creeped out when experiencing it for the first time. I don't think it has that same staying power as the others. It's a track that I feel is trying just a bit too hard to unsettle the player. And what amounts to this issue is the fact that once it starts, there's a good chance that it's not going to stop. I've gone through certain nights where this track just goes on and on and on, and that's because its appearance is directly associated with the activity of the animatronics. Once one of them enters your hallway, for example, you're bound to hear this track start up, almost working as a warning to the player that they should check on the hallway. And we can't forget that adding this up with the music box, the cameras, mangle, and the fact this track is actually getting played over the other ambient track that continues in the background, and things do start becoming slightly overwhelming in the audio department for me. Bear in mind, I can definitely say this won't be an issue for everyone when it comes to the scare factor the game presents. I'm simply identifying that from my point of view, the ever-presence, overtness, and relative repetitiveness from this track presents a potential problem for that side of things. We can't forget, I'm calling this a track, when realistically it basically boils down to the exact same piece of audio playing over and over again. And because of that, and how often we hear it play through each night, you could also argue that it has the chance to become rather stale after a while. As we've already talked about, horror's very based on people's emotions. And although much like every genre, there's conventional traits which have been laid out that define what makes something scary, the actual achievement of that goal can widely vary depending on who's interacting with the piece of media. In my case, I enjoyed the subtlety of the first game's ambience. I feel it left more of an impact on me when it came to what it was actually trying to achieve. Fnaf 2 still left an impact on me, and I do still find it distinct, but I mean it more in the sense that it was memorable compared to actually creeping me out. The intentionality of it is my biggest problem realistically. All of that talk has obviously been related to one sole thing, however, and that's the atmosphere, of course. But what about the implications it has on the gameplay this time round? Well, as I mentioned when discussing the animatronics, there's many here which use audio cues as a way of notifying their presence, telling us when they're moving, but also occasionally where they're located and what animatronic it is. For most of the animatronics, we mainly hear the same kind of footstep sound we heard previously, which is fine due to how most of them merely perform the same function of reaching your office and requiring us to put on our mask. But you've also got others like Mangle and Balloon Boy, who create metallic rattling sounds and laughs respectively.
Hi. Hello.
And although these give personality to each of them, they ultimately provide the exact same purpose of letting the player know when they're on the move. Debatably, the most important sounds we now hear are in relation to our vents. While it's never made clear from the audio what animatronics entered our vents and what side they've entered from, that isn't particularly relevant for the most part. Once you hear that vent sound, whether it be a withered who comes straight into your room or a toy that waits in the vents, it's a notification to the player that the usage of their mask is imminent. And while some people may be annoyed at the possible confusion that could lead from the right and left audio channels not being used to notify us of which side they're coming from, that could realistically be more beneficial when it comes to utilising the camera system a bit more outside of solely staying locked on the prize corner. Outside of that, there's not much that differs to what we've already seen, and I'd say that's related to how audio isn't particularly as important in this game. That for me can be linked back to the switch from the power system to the flashlight. While we were still having to check on Pirate's Cove frequently, FNAF 1 was all about conserving power, and as a result of that, every footstep you heard, every time you heard Chica in the kitchen, every time you heard Freddy laugh, it presented the player both with the fear that these guys were approaching closer, but also were helpful at points when it came to saving your power. If you can hear that Chica's in the kitchen, for example, there's no need to pull up your camera for the purpose of checking on her. While the general footsteps could help us in locating animatronics and slowing them down with our flashlight, something I still see as a step in the right direction from the first game, this prevention method isn't worthwhile enough to be utilised in any of the later nights. We want to save that flashlight mainly for our hallway, and we can always tell when someone's in our hallway because of that second ambient track that plays. And then you've got the jump scares, where audio once again is the key factor when it comes to making the player jump. On that side of things, you can't really say it's too different to what we already heard before. The sound itself is different, with it being a lower pitched, distorted scream, but it is still a scream. And although it's lacking that bizarre quality I felt in regards to the first game's jump scare, it's not really that different, and is ultimately trying to achieve the exact same effect. When it comes to how these look, there's yet again an inconsistency that presents itself with many of them, which on one hand brings more variety into these animations, and on the other ends up resulting in jump scares that just don't look very good. For a lot of these now, you'll receive a visual of the animatronic leaping towards you. As you can see, despite obviously looking different, animatronics like Foxy, Toy Bonnie, and the Marionette all play a very similar animation of diving right into your face. And then there's others who pop up right in front of us in a fashion that's more similar to the first game. These would be ones like Withered Freddy, Withered Chica, and Toy Freddy's jump scares. I wouldn't say it's as simple as that though, because the quality between many of these can vary wildly. While most of the ones I already mentioned look fine, you've still got a slight annoyance I've always felt that carries over from the first game, where they always freeze right at the end of the animation. This applies to all the jump scares here, and will start appearing more awkward the more you see them, because of how it almost breaks the flow of the jump scare itself. I'm not sure if this is intentional, or if it's related to some kind of loading issue when taking us to the game over screen, but either way, it's always bugged me. The movement's also something I've got a bit of a problem with. While I still think audio plays the biggest role in scaring the player, it can't be denied that the fast, herky-jerky movement we saw from the animatronics in the first game also added to the scare. It's not only a strange visual to begin with, but it's also a direct contrast to how we've seen them throughout the game. Before the jump scare, we only ever see them appear completely static in the doorways and camera screen, but upon getting inside our office, they move at lightning speed. And I think both these qualities fall off dramatically when it comes to some of these. Take Toy Freddy and Bonnie's for example. Freddy at the very least is constantly moving right in our face before we're taken to the game over screen, but I find the pace to be so tame and the movements to be so unsubstantial that the sound becomes the only thing that's really scary about the jump scare. This is where appearances come into play. Because of how friendly and colourful Toy Freddy looks, I don't think there's anything you can particularly identify in the actual visual side of this jump scare which is truly scary. The previous game's animations may look goofy on their own, but many of the images also convey that same sinister emotion that I've described before. Toy Bonnie has that exact same problem when it comes to how he looks during the jump scare, but I also take issue with the fact that his jump scare is one single jump towards the camera and that's it. No additional movement whatsoever, which only amplifies the problem of them always becoming static images for a brief second. There's others though that I think are just lazy, with the key example of that being Withered Bonnie. This one not only has that same lack of movement which I've identified in some of the others, but I also don't think it blends into the scene whatsoever. It's another case where it feels like something's merely been placed in front of the office screen, which is of course what's actually happening, but you don't want it to feel like that. You want it to feel like they've actually made their way into your office and are taking you down. At the end of the day, do I think these jump scares are an improvement? Not really. I found them to become as equally tame as the first games after the same relatively short amount of exposure. I still think the lack of variety when it comes to the audio effect is a problem, as while it makes the jump scare memorable upon hearing it enough times, that doesn't correlate to it remaining as scary as the first time you heard it. And as we saw with the animations, a large amount of these ultimately feel like a step back, to be honest. Some appear lazy, some are over too quick, some don't have enough movement. You can almost feel Cawthon cutting corners with some of these because of how many unique jump scares he's now having to implement, but that's not a good enough excuse. He's ultimately the one who decided to add more animatronics in the first place. If they don't live up to, and perhaps even exceed what we saw previously, reduce their numbers until you've got a more manageable collection of characters. So when it comes to the audio in this game, I wouldn't describe it as an outright miss. The best thing it does is add a certain degree of character to some of the animatronics, but when it comes to things like the general ambience and the impact it has on the gameplay, I'm rather nonplussed. Despite the grievances I brought up, I wouldn't say they impact the experience to any great degree. As I say, I'm mainly looking for improvement in these departments compared to anything else, and I just don't see that here particularly. One thing I haven't mentioned up till now is that right at the start of the game, and in between every night, we end up getting these short sequences in which we appear to be brought back to the original location in Fnaf 1. From the mask we can see, we're looking from Freddy's perspective, with Chica to our left and Bonnie to our right. I really enjoy these sequences, as they once again introduce that brilliant sense of intrigue when it comes to what we're actually seeing and what we should interpret from it. But additionally, the scenes themselves feed right into that more subtle creepiness that I was actually searching for. The noises we hear in the back once again have this dark, almost hollow quality, with these brief, sharp metallic sounds cutting through to keep us on edge. And with each progressing one, things only seem to get weirder and weirder. The first two are very similar, and are exactly what I already described. A view of what seems to be the old pizzeria's dining area from Freddy's perspective. The only difference is that when looking at Bonnie and Chica on the second night, instead of them looking straight in front, they're looking directly at us. The third night shows the two looking at us once again, but in this instance, Chica's stance almost makes it appear like she's angrily screaming at us, while Bonnie's eyes now appear to have either disappeared or have turned black. Golden Freddy even makes an appearance here, so while we aren't given that much information, it's clear that our minds are supposed to be drawn back to the 5 kids who were killed in the first game. What's even more poignant when thinking about this is the reappearance of the "It's me" message after each of these. It's still completely up in the air what this even means, but we can at least start theorizing now that this is what it could be relating to. A potential admission from the murderer that it was him who killed the kids perhaps. Although, that doesn't really get us anywhere considering we don't currently know who the murderer even is, and what his motivations were. The fourth and final scene puts all focus on the marionette who now makes an appearance, standing right in front of us and following our movements when looking at Bonnie and Chica. It should be noted that despite showing clear emotion in the previous 2 nights, they now go back to simply staring straight forward, almost like the puppets put them back in their place and holds a degree of power in comparison to them. Whatever it may be, and also whenever this takes place, it's telling us that at a certain point in time, the puppet was in direct contact with the animatronics in Fnaf 1. The implications of that are unclear, but it's once again these ideas that are getting thrown out there which still remain incredibly interesting. Throwing the marionette into the fold only adds to that even more. It's the only instance we've seen of a new animatronic introduced in Fnaf 2 interacting with the old characters, which much like this scene already conveys somewhat, gives the marionette a level of importance that isn't met by any of the others. Not to mention as well, the design of his mask is very similar to the crying child images we saw in the first game, a decision that ends up retroactively creating an impact, and throwing up a whole host of questions and theories on how significant the puppet's role has been in all this. Just like every night, we cut straight back to the office after these scenes, and with night 5, we once again reach a point where Phone Guy finds himself panicked, the reason as to why only being alluded to by him.
Oh, hey, good job, night 5. Keep a close eye on things tonight, okay? From what I understand, the building is on lockdown. No one is allowed in or out, especially concerning any previous employees.
It seems the police investigation of the pizzerias discovered something, with the building apparently being put on lockdown, with no one being allowed in or out. Specifically, there seems to be something up with one of the previous employees who worked here, and although Phone Guy is the only colleague we've actually heard from, we can't forget that another mystery character was also mentioned right at the start of the game, that being the guy who previously worked in our position, but ended up taking over the day shift.
You're only the second guard to work at that location. The first guy finished his week, but complained about conditions. We switched him over to the day shift.
We're told that once we get through this night, we're going to be switched over to the day shift. And although a replacement hasn't yet been found for our position, they're going to try getting contact with the owner of the original Freddy Fazbear restaurant.
We're going to try to contact the original restaurant owner. I think the name of the place was Fredbear's Family Diner or something like that. It was closed for years, though. I doubt we'll be able to track anybody down.
This is the first time we get a clear-cut reference towards Fnaf 2 being a prequel, as although the restaurant in Fnaf 1 was simply called Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, we're told here that the original restaurant was actually called Fredbear's Family Diner. Much like many of the other plot threads we've heard about, these things will eventually get elaborated on as we get deeper into the series. But we can't forget, just like the first game, Fnaf 2 is filled to the brim with secrets that occasionally go a long way in pushing the story forward. However, these are secrets that once again are predominantly hidden behind RNG, and although some of the most vital ones are a bit more accessible this time round, there's also other creepy occurrences we can witness that are incredibly rare as well. Many of these are quite similar to those seen in Fnaf 1. For example, much like the eyeless Bonnie screen that we could potentially see when returning to the main menu, there's now 3 variants of these screens that are now focused on Withered Freddy, Toy Bonnie, and Withered Foxy. These appeared just as eerie as before, however instead of pure silence like Bonnie's, which admittedly was a pretty scary quality in itself, we now hear the sound of our failing hallway light getting played. Still really bizarre, and I'd argue a large part of that once again stems from where they present themselves, and how often they do present themselves. In my opinion, the rarity is arguably the most important factor with these things, because if the player bears witness to them too much, you end up in the same position as the jump scares, where you simply become accustomed to them. These screens once again have a 1 in 1,000 chance of showing up, but they're actually made even rarer considering where some of these present themselves. Bonnie and Foxy appear after the game over screen and when starting a night respectively. Both instances a player could find themselves in many times while playing. However, Freddy only has a chance of showing up after the warning message at the start, and considering this is only shown when opening up the game, that realistically makes it far less common to see. Either way, they're all still damn creepy. The fact they show up out of seemingly nowhere is even more surprising compared to the game's jump scares, and in this instance, you don't need a loud scream to unsettle the player. It's merely a matter of the unnerving visual and the breaking of expectation that does the job well. When it comes to the game, whereas before we saw several instances of the environment changing within our camera screen, this time round there's a larger emphasis on having things show up in our office, and also more focus revolved around secret animatronics compared to the environment. Starting with the cameras, there's a few standout secrets we can witness, some of which are shown almost completely randomly, and others that require certain events to have taken place. Take the appearance of the endoskeleton referred to as Endo-02. This is the endoskeleton that's found within many of the animatronics, and while it can appear once the marionette has left its music box, I'm not entirely sure why it does. There doesn't appear to be any real link between this and the marionette initially, although it does appear quite creepy from how we see it in both the prize corner and our left vent occasionally. It doesn't seem to hold any great deal of significance, and also isn't a threat. Something else we're able to see when the puppets left the prize corner are some brief images that pop up on particular cameras. The camera these show up on is random, and the way in which they're able to be seen requires us to quickly turn our flashlight on and off several times. And if you're on the correct camera, you'll eventually start seeing these images flash on screen for a split second. While this appears to hold the same level of significance as the endoskeleton, it does at least give us a brief insight towards the increasing level of power and control we've started relating towards the marionette, as we established in the small cutscenes in between each night. Once the marionette came into the picture, all the animatronics who previously were acting up went right back into their usual behaviour we saw at the start. It's unclear if these images are merely a hallucination, or are actually being shown on the camera system, but either way, no other animatronic has had the ability to do something like this. They've been aware of the cameras and aware that we're watching them, but the puppet takes things a step further and actually starts messing around with the cameras, or potentially messing around with our mind. The final notable appearance we're able to see on the cameras is found in the parts and service room. In the event that there's no other animatronics in the room, there's a chance when accessing our cameras that we'll see a purple version of Golden Freddy. This guy's referred to as Shadow Freddy, and although his appearance is conveyed in a similar manner to that of Golden Freddy, we don't have him show up in our room and jump scare us or anything. He's just another weird oddity that had players going crazy at the time in regards to why he's even here and how he relates to the story. Switching our view to things that start appearing in our office, the first of these can actually be identified more clearly when observing our cameras once again, and that's the paper buddy that makes its way into our room during the custom night. These are the figures made out of paper plates that we can see in Party Room 4, and while there's usually 3 hung up on the wall, you'll sometimes find the one on the left ends up disappearing. Interestingly, this is actually tied to the AI levels which we discussed in the first game, with there being a 1 in 100 chance for the paper buddy's AI level to raise from 0 to 1 during the night. After this occurs, it then needs to successfully complete its movement opportunity, which is about a 1 in 20 chance every 5 seconds, and you'll find it ends up in your office. Once again, this thing isn't a threat, but even if it ends up here, it won't affect the gameplay whatsoever. It basically turns into another piece of decoration. The final two are not only even rarer to see compared to the paper buddy, but are also a lot creepier. The first is another secret animatronic referred to as JJ, with this one having a random chance to spawn under your desk whenever you close your camera system. While this once again has no effect on the gameplay, we see what appears to be a female version of Balloon Boy simply staring at us, before eventually disappearing when pulling your camera back up. An incredibly subtle secret, but a creepy one nonetheless. The final of these, however, is the rarest of them all, and is the most similar to that of Golden Freddy, and that's the animatronic RWQ, another shadow version of a pre-existing animatronic, this time being Toy Bonnie. This guy has a 1 in almost 16,000 chance of spawning in when closing your camera, appearing on the left side of your office and having its entire body be jet black, with the only exception being its eyes and teeth, which are white. This guy does actually affect your game, but it's basically the same case as Golden Freddy, where because the occurrence is so rare, most players are going to be willing to receive the consequence out of pure curiosity. And while there's no jump scare this time, if you don't turn on your flashlight, which is the only way to make RWQ fade away, he'll simply crash the game. Once again, a truly bizarre thing to experience solely because of how rare it is. And although Golden Freddy had his own jump scare, the ultimate effect between the two is relatively identical. Both have their unique unsettling qualities. Golden Freddy with his slumped over appearance and close-up position, and RWQ with his towering size and mostly unrecognizable features. Because of how similar both of their appearances are, it starts making us wonder immediately if there's potentially a link between the two. With all of these things I've just mentioned, however, despite appearing creepy and weird, there's nothing here that's truly pushing the story forward. There's nothing like those newspaper articles we saw in the first game that give us a greater idea of what's going on outside of merely what we're experiencing. That's not to say there's nothing of the sort, however, as this side of things actually evolves in a pretty massive way this time round. The only difference is that compared to having this discovery be found in our office or on our cameras, we're now given the chance to play through 4 short mini-games upon getting jump scared. RNG of course plays a factor in this, with there being a 1 in 10 chance each time we die for one of these to show up. But when it comes to what we see in these, the information we're given is vital, clarifying details from the past and setting things up for the future. While you perform different activities in each of them, they all have this same low-res 8-bit graphic style that creates a stark contrast to the more realistic visuals we witness in-game. And starting with the first minigame, from the initial room we start in, we can immediately see that we found ourselves in our office, and when journeying forward and investigating many of the different rooms, it seems that we're in the same pizzeria as Fnaf 2's. This is made even more obvious when looking at the layout overall, with the design essentially being identical to our map on the camera screen. As we wander through the pizzeria, there's 3 key things that continually present themselves to us: the animatronics, the several pools of blood that can be found in multiple rooms, and what also appears to be the dead bodies that are sitting nearby. After leaving the first room, the puppet makes an appearance, serving as a form of guidance when following him from room to room. You'll always find when either following him to the room with the present or walking into any of the dead bodies, the game will immediately cut back to the same effect that led us into the minigame and take us back to the main menu. Once you discover those pools of blood and dead bodies, it becomes quite obvious what this minigame's trying to convey. Just like in Fnaf 1, there's been 5 kids that have been murdered, which is assumedly why the police have launched an investigation on the pizzeria, and also perhaps why the animatronics have started acting up and getting more aggressive. However, even within this secret minigame, there's other secrets that can also be found. For example, when entering each room, there's a chance for Golden Freddy to spawn in, where upon walking up to him, his eyes will turn white and he'll then swiftly disappear. The second secret is a bit rarer to witness, however, it's also far more important. Whenever you enter a room to the right hand side, there's a 1 in 100 chance for a purple man to spawn in. Upon achieving this, he'll dart directly towards you and end the minigame once again, crashing your game in the process. However, there's 2 key differences which are shown in this case. The first being how the red lines which flash on screen have now been turned blue, and also the fact that much like the "It's me" message we see on screen during the brief cutscenes between each night, we see a similar message for a split second before the game crashes. However, this time, the message reads, "You can't." This ties into the audio that plays during this minigame, as alongside the distortion effects which play in the back, we also hear the muffled sounds of someone throwing out what initially appear to be random letters. And if you pay attention, we eventually discover that all these letters end up spelling "save them," which makes the reply of "you can't" a whole lot more sinister. While all of this goes unsaid, it's now starting to become a bit clearer as to who the murderer actually is. As the latter message is only revealed when running into this purple guy, the natural assumption to make is that he is the one telling us this, and as he also showed a sort of malice when charging straight towards us and ending our game, it's also reasonable to now associate these murders with this figure. Now, while it may seem like we're lacking anything truly substantial, considering we still have no idea who this purple guy actually is and why he's killed these children, there's a key detail we can see on his torso that gives a much greater perspective on what his job role was. And the reason this is important is because, as you can see, he appears to be wearing some kind of golden badge. The type of badge you can imagine someone wearing as part of their uniform when working in the role of a security guard. This is where we can start drawing links to other parts of the game to start getting some real reasonable conclusions. If we go with the idea of this guy being a security guard who was working at Freddy Fazbear's, we can once again assume that with the ease of access he'd be able to have with the animatronics during his night shift, a time where he's left completely alone, this purple guy's more than likely the same person who's been tampering around with their facial recognition systems.
Someone may have tampered with their facial recognition systems, we're not sure. But the characters have been acting very unusual, almost aggressive towards the staff.
And when it comes to the time frame of when he could have done all these things, we only need to look back to night 1 to hear mention of the previous night guard that worked here before us, and how we're only the second person to work in the same role.
You're only the second guard to work at that location. The first guy finished his week but complained about conditions. We switched him over to the day shift.
So, we've now got ourselves a real antagonist. It's still unclear why he's done all these things, but with all the evidence and links we've gathered, this purple guy, who was previously working the night shift, is the one responsible for the 5 children's murders here, and is more than likely also responsible for the other 5 murders we heard about in the first game. This plot thread only gets deeper when looking at the 3 remaining minigames, the second of which puts us in the role of Freddy once again. However, compared to the white-eyed version we saw wandering around during the nighttime, this appears to be a look at the activities Freddy performs during the day. Our main task here is to hand out cake to all the children. However, the detail which most players will be fixated on is the crying child who seems to be left outside. As we continue, Freddy gets slower and slower, resulting in all the kids turning red and getting progressively more angry. Focusing at the top of the screen once again though, we end up seeing another recurring figure, with a purple car drawing up to the building and a purple guy stepping out to interact with the crying child. The child's eyes and tears grow wider and wider, until they eventually turn entirely grey, with the minigame closing things off with a marionette jump scare. Appropriate, of course, as we've already drawn several comparisons between the crying child images and the puppet, but it's good to at least get some confirmation in regards to this aspect. Needless to say, what we witness here is the purple guy outright killing a child. We see the fear conveyed from the child when it comes to the wide eyes and massive stream of tears, and the grey figure it becomes afterwards isn't too far off what we saw with the dead bodies in the previous minigame. We now also know that whoever this person is, their soul would go on to inhabit the marionette, so while still being unclear, there's a significance to them being locked outside and being killed by the purple guy. It appears that in some ways, this story's now appearing to revolve around revenge, with all these children being murdered by the same guy, and with how we're told their behaviour towards adults is much stranger compared to how they behave towards kids. There's almost a level of trauma that's now present in the animatronics. Their trust was betrayed by an adult, a figure that when you're young, carries a sense of authority no matter who the adult is. Their behaviour in turn could now all be seen as a result of this. They're untrusting of any and every adult they come across because of what Purple Guy did to them. The third minigame puts us in the role of the puppet, where very simply, we give 4 gifts to what look like 4 dead kids, and then give them life, in which we're shown the heads of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica and Foxy getting placed on them, with the jump scare at the end appropriately being Golden Freddy, the 5th child who was murdered. While this one's short and to the point, it's still an important piece of story development. All of this is of course supernatural, but we're now seeing the significance of the puppet, and their role in placing the kids' souls in the animatronics, while fans still ponder on factors like if the puppet was the first child to be killed, something which is somewhat up in the air due to details that are revealed later on. It's without a doubt the most important figure when it comes to all the kids that have been brought back to life in the form of the animatronics. The fourth and final minigame is equally simple, although not as insightful particularly. Taking control of Foxy, we run into the adjacent room a couple times to surprise some children. However, when doing this for a third time, the purple guy appears in the corner of the room, and when entering the next room this time, all 4 children appear to be dead. So by the end of all these, we've now got a proper thread to focus on in terms of the story. While the discovery of it is still rather obscure, we now have an antagonist in the form of Purple Guy, somewhat of a saviour when it comes to the puppet, and a much deeper understanding of what's going on and why the animatronics behave in the way they do. To not convolute things, this is a story about a tragic event committed by an evil person, and so far, it appears that we've merely been an observer. Our role as the Night Guard hasn't been a factor towards anything particularly. In both games, it seems that we've merely been a non-entity that found ourselves in the middle of something a whole lot more sinister. Yet again, I find myself somewhere in the middle when it comes to telling a story in this way, although I do still have somewhat of a problem when it comes to the obscure nature of it, as you're leaving yourself in a position where a large group of players might not experience something they'd actually really enjoy. It's undeniable that the overall mystery surrounding the plot is still a massive reason towards why it remains so intriguing and generated so much interest. It carries on exactly where Fnaf 1 left off. But one thing I have to praise immensely is that we're now actually getting answers to certain questions that were set up in the first game. There's too many instances where games feature mysterious plots but leave too many details up in the air, resulting in the narrative overall feeling unsatisfying and almost unfinished. Fnaf 2 avoids that by fleshing out details we bear witness to in the first game, and adding to them in a way where the general plot has now become tangible. The discovery of it may still be hidden somewhat, but it really isn't that convoluted once it's revealed to you. So reaching the end of night 5, we get our $100.50, and find out we've been playing as a guy called Jeremy Fitzgerald. The most important detail, however, is the date which is printed on this check, because as you're able to see, this game actually takes place in 1987, which means that all this time we've been on the same year and have been working in the same establishment where the bite of 87 occurred. The only thing is that when we come into night 6, which returns from the first game, it's heavily implied that the bite hasn't even occurred yet. Phone Guy in this one sounds as panicked as he's ever been, and on top of that, it's one of the first times where he appears to be talking to us in a more direct manner.
Hello. What on earth are you doing there? Didn't you get the memo? The place is closed down, at least for a while. Someone used one of the suits. We had a spare in the back, a yellow one. Someone used it. Now none of them are acting right.
I'm not sure if this means he's always been talking to us on the phone, or if night 6 is the only instance where Phone Guy calls us up directly instead of leaving a message. But either way, asking us what are you still doing here obviously doesn't make sense in the context of a message, as he's surprised that we've come back. More importantly, he now confirms the pizzeria has been closed down for a while following the investigation, which makes our character seem pretty insane for coming back when we know how dangerous this place already is. The rest of this phone call was quite confusing, however. He talks about how someone used one of the suits in the back, one which we can presume is perhaps Golden Freddy, with how he describes it as a yellow one, and as a result of that, now none of them are acting right, meaning the rest of the animatronics. So what is he actually referring to here? We've just been through how the animatronics are more than likely behaving the way they have, because they're possessed with the dead children's souls. We also know from what we were told previously that Purple Guy dressed up in one of these suits to lead the children in the back rooms and kill them. Both these things make sense, but I don't understand why we're being made aware of this now. We've known from night 1 that these guys haven't been acting right. So was he telling us this from the point of view that we're unaware of their strange behaviour? I'm not sure, but either way, we know the kids are dead. We know the animatronics are possessed, and we now know from Phone Guy that despite the place getting shut down, they've apparently got one more birthday party to organise for tomorrow. We're also told that after we finish our night, we'll be switched over to the day shift.
We have one more event scheduled for tomorrow, a birthday. You'll be on day shift. Wear your uniform. Stay close to the animatronics. Make sure they don't hurt anyone, okay?
And this is where it's speculated as to who the victim is of the bite of 87, as when being told how we should handle tomorrow, Phone Guy tells us two key things: wear our uniform and stay close to the animatronics. While the bite victim's never 100% confirmed, this is just about enough to show the possibility that Jeremy Fitzgerald is the bite victim. At the end of the day, while we're told in the first game the bite left the victim without a frontal lobe, it's also said that they survived. And with the size of the animatronics and power we can assume they have, it's more likely that if it was a kid, they would have outright died. When reaching the end of night 6, we get one more news article detailing the closure of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and all this does really is set up the events of the first game, telling us how despite the new animatronics are being scrapped because of how they are malfunctioning, the original models are being retained, so in the event another restaurant opens, they've got some characters to fall back on. This is why we see the withered animatronics in the first game, despite these toy animatronics seeming so much more advanced. As we see from the quote at the bottom of the article, the CEO claims they're confident they'll reopen someday, even if it is with a much smaller budget. And again, we can very much see that from the pizzeria in the first game. It's smaller in size, there's only one area for restaurant goers to go in, compared to the pizzeria in this game that had multiple party rooms, a game area and a prize corner. It wraps things up nicely, and shows how Fnaf 1 still works despite this being a prequel, which is quite ingenious realistically, as if we're looking from a game development point of view, Fnaf 1's location seems like more of a step back because Cawthon became more elaborate with his sequel. The fact he managed to actually come up with a narrative reason as to why Fazbear Entertainment was taking a step back too was great. Just like the first game, we unlock the custom night after beating night 6, where we can obviously customize each animatronic's AI level, once again ranging from 0 to 20. But this time, we can also choose one of 7 different challenges that are now on offer. A fantastic addition, as all of them provide unique experiences, while also retaining that preset element which I enjoyed during the main nights. Customizing the values yourself is still an option, and I'm glad it's still here. But going through each of these challenges presents an actual sense of achievement this time, compared to before where the challenge was more self-imposed. Throughout these, we get ones like Double Trouble, that has you mainly going up against the two versions of Bonnie, New and Shiny, which has you going up against solely the toys, and you've now got an official 420 mode. Instead this time it's referred to as Golden Freddy, and obviously now applies to 10 different animatronics. That sense of achievement is easily my favourite part about these. Not only do I find the unique combinations we're given to be entertaining to deal with, but with each one we complete, we get a star on the custom night screen to mark its completion, as well as a toy figure on our office table that correlates to whatever challenge we've completed. Excellent stuff, and a brilliant incentive to get players coming back to the game and giving them an actual reason to test their skills. Overall, despite the shortcomings I went over, I still really enjoy Fnaf 2. Is it as good as the first one? No, I don't think so. But admittedly, I hold the first game in such high regard that not many games in the series even come close. The key highlight I always point out about Fnaf 2 is that the gameplay is damn engaging. You're constantly on the move, your mind's always focusing on something, whether it be the music box, Foxy, your vents. I still find this game really fun to play. Do I think it's all that scary? No. I find most of the jump scares to be inferior to the first games, and I don't find the setup to them to be as effective. As we've seen, the build-up is so important towards achieving a jump scare's full effect, and I've never particularly felt that Fnaf 2 achieves that very well. But again, there's a flip side to that, as although I find something like the visuals contribute to that less scary atmosphere, all the animatronics which are featured here look fantastic. While the toys aren't scary whatsoever, I can at least appreciate them from a design point of view. I think the higher level of attention to detail is noticeable with these, and it's once again reinforcing the Fnaf style that essentially becomes set in stone after this game. Much like many of the other games, while I would never describe this one as pure perfection, there's nothing that would ever turn me away from returning to it. A key factor which I think plays into that being the pacing of the game. Even if you're having a tough time on certain nights, both the first and second game are still relatively short experiences. But as I've discussed many times in the past, a game's length is only ever an issue if you aren't utilising it correctly. When looking purely at the main 5 to 6 nights, I'm not left feeling unfulfilled or that the experience was cut short. With each night, the progression is noticeable, and in the case of Fnaf 2, although I'm already left satisfied from the level of challenge I'm dealing with in night 6, you've now also got those custom night challenges where you can take things to another level.